President Trump may accomplish something that his predecessors tried many times and failed to do. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, kind of unusual news coming out of a couple of abortion providers. The Maine Family Planning Group and Planned Parenthood of Illinois have both announced that because of new Trump administration rules through the Health and Human Services Department that require a separation between the provision of abortion and the provision of other healthcare services from family planning centers, that they're just going to turn down the federal money because they don't want to have to dance to the federal government's tune. Bill, this sounds like a very conservative kind of thing to do, doesn't it?
It's brilliant. What else do you say?
Brilliant on the part of Planned Parenthood or the Trump administration?
Brilliant on the part of Donald Trump. I think I was reading an analysis on Instapundit. It said that Scott Adams had predicted that these kind of three phases would happen. Phase number one would be that Donald Trump is a Nazi, and then that would wear off. And then phase number two would be that he's an idiot and incompetent. And then when that ran its course, phase number three would be to admit that he's effective, but that we just think what his effectiveness is doing is bad for the country. And I remember seeing a Instapundit post, might have been by Steve Green, saying we're now rapidly entering phase three. What I find, my first take on this, Scott, is that so many of the issues that seem to be utterly intractable and inevitable, historical inevitabilities. China's economic rise is unstoppable. The Palestinian conflict can never be resolved. North Korea is going to continue to develop nuclear weapons. On and on and on and on and on. You can't bring jobs back to America. You can't bring manufacturing jobs back to America. All of it. Piece by piece, it seems to me that all of this stuff is being dismantled by somebody who simply has the will to do it against the tide of the public criticism that you get for these kind of things. I think when it's all said and done, that Donald Trump's most essential facility, the one quality in the man that we absolutely could not do without, is just plain thickness of his hide. He does something like this. It's a great example of the kind of thing I'm talking about was this idea of, well, we don't believe in sanctuary cities, but since you are one, we're just going to drop all of the illegal aliens for you here. He's basically making the left play by its own rules. And when they're calling him every name in the book for doing so, he just doesn't seem to care. In fact, there's a fair amount of evidence now that he understands well enough that the more he pushes them, the crazier they get, and the more certain his reelection becomes and a chance to do more things to make America great again.
So, Bill, it's been illegal for a long time to use federal funds to provide abortions. However, the providers of abortions around the country have gotten around this by basically saying that the federal grants we're receiving, some $260 million a year going to some 90 different recipient organizations, these grants were going to pay for contraception, fertility treatment, screening for cancer, STDs, and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
When the Trump administration proposed these rules through the Health and Human Services Department last year, 4 federal district courts in Maryland and 1 on the West Coast issued preliminary injunctions preventing these rules from going into effect. But get this, Bill, as a Los Angeles guy, the California-based U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit overturned those decisions and allowed the Trump administration to move ahead. Have we just woken up in bizarro world?
Well, it is really kind of a million monkeys at a million typewriters kind of situation, isn't it, Scott?
Eventually producing the works of Shakespeare.
Yeah, if you have them working long enough, typing long enough, and this seems to be a case of going over to monkey number 627-519, reading the first line, and it says, "To be or not to be, that is the Kavartzel." And
idiot.
But even they seem to get things right every now and then. And since the Ninth Circuit Court since their previous decisions have been so impenetrable in terms of understanding what they're doing in any way other than looking at progressive agenda, I do find that remarkable, but I'll take all the wins I can get, and we've been seeming to be doing a lot of that lately.
The threshold of this rule seems interesting to me, Bill, the trigger point here, because even though under the new federal rules from the Trump administration, an abortion clinic cannot refer people for abortions or provide abortions at the same facility where they're providing these health services that are receiving federal grants, they can provide non-directive counseling on abortion. And the Planned Parenthood group in Illinois said, forget it. We're not going to accept $3 million a year from this federal program because we can't provide abortions on the same site where we can do STD screenings and cancer screenings, and we can't even give non-directive advice about abortions.
See, this is the genius of all of these moves. And another thing it reminds me of, and again, I'll come back to specifics in just a moment, but it reminds me of the one of the last segments we did on Bill Whittle Now, where the Trump administration basically said to the people in Washington who were the bureaucrats who were running the Bureau of Land Management, no, we're not saying you're fired or anything. We're just saying if you want to, manage land out in Montana, you should go live in Montana. And that kind of a move it really is checkmate for the left, because then they have to decide whether or not they're going to do what they say or whether they're going to do what they want. And when you put these kind of questions in that fashion, the results are spectacular. What Donald Trump has done in this particular case is say, all right, you say that you are keeping your abortion facilities and your health planning facilities completely separate, the monies rather. You're keeping the money separate. So since the monies are separate, you have to go and find another place to do the abortion-related stuff. And the fact that Planned Parenthood says no, would rather lose the $300 million, is, needless to say, an open admission that these services were being mixed the entire time, and that the horror of so many million Americans that they were paying tax money to have abortions performed on their dollar had been going on the entire time. Because if they hadn't been going on the entire time, this wouldn't be the kind of sacrifice that would cause Planned Parenthood to turn down that kind of money.
A couple of weeks ago, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio announced that, and who's also, by the way, a Democratic presidential candidate, announced, isn't everybody, but
you could say, by the way, in the future, between now and November of 2020, just go ahead and say, mention a Democrat's name, and if it turns out they're not running for president, then you could probably just make a point of saying that.
Okay. He announced that New York would forego its $1.3 million a year if this new set of rules takes effect. After the HHS issued its notice, New York had no comment. Maine Family Planning, by the way, went a little further, Bill, and this is all part of federal Title 10, a federal program called Title 10. Maine is not just saying we're going to refuse this money for now. The Maine Family Planning organization is withdrawing from the program entirely, rather than just turning the money down. Do you see this as a trend that picks up? And if it does, Bill, do you think progressives will step up and provide the $60 million a year in funding that the federal government is not doing anymore?
This is another beautiful, beautiful thing, because it basically points out once again the chasm that exists between what a progressive or a liberal says and what they actually do. You said $260 million?
$260 million going to 90 recipients. By the way, nearly half of that money goes to Planned Parenthood.
Okay, so but that's the money that Maine is basically walking away from.
No, Maine's just walking away from their portion of the $260 million that goes across the country.
Okay, so good. So it's got to be some significantly smaller part of that, because Maine's population not absolutely tremendous. So this is the kind of thing that Steven Spielberg or Jeff Zuckerman could write a check for. What's it going to come to? 50 million maybe? Tops? 20, 30 million? Peanuts. Get out the checkbook. You're always you're always demanding that the people who have more are parted with their money, and so that it can be spent on things like this. Well, now you've got your opportunity to show people just how virtuous you are. And so I don't think it'd be a tough thing for Barbra Streisand to have a fundraiser at her fabulous house and put together the money necessary to replace the entire national $260 million. That should be a no-brainer. Zuckerman or any of these guys could write a check for this without even missing it. I mean, it's $250 million. Bezos has in excess of $50 billion now. If it were me, and if it were my principles, if somebody said to me, Scott, that gun ownership or let's say First Amendment, let's just make it even clearer, First Amendment rights were being absolutely abolished in this country because of what was happening on campus or whatever the case may be. And in order to fight this, we're going to have to give up our federal funding, and we're going to need $260 million to preserve free speech in this country. We're going to need it every year. If I'm a billionaire with $41,000 billion and you tell me I need $250 million, not only was that something I would pay for immediately from my own pocket because I happen to think freedom of speech and things like that are important, but certainly if it was a bit onerous, and it doesn't seem to be, I'd call 2 or 3 of my other billionaire friends and we'd get it down to $50, $60 million a year. That's catering money, for these people. So yes, great. Donald Trump once again has put them in a position to live up to their professed ideals, not what they actually do. And so if you really think we should be paying more in taxes, and if you really think that we should raise taxes in order to pay for programs like this, well, it turns out that you are perfectly free to make a donation to this, which I'm quite sure would be tax deductible too, by the way. And there's your problem solved. So once again, do as I say, not as I do. And this is a tremendous ruling, not only because it once again provides another example of hypocrisy that runs this whole thing, and it's even better than that. Even better than that, obviously, is the fact that now, at least on the horizon, we can see some relief for Americans who have had to carry the burden for a long time now, the burden of conscience that the checks that they write to the federal government or the money that's being withheld from their paycheck is being used to pay for abortions against their will. This should be an enormous relief to people like that. But most importantly of all, it shows you what can actually be done and how simple it is.
Well, that's what strikes me, Bill, about this. In fact, it strikes me in particular because of the person who's in the Oval Office right now. Because what this is a procedural move in accordance with existing law.
Yes.
It is not preening and crowing and moralizing. It is basically saying, look, there's a long-standing law. We just want to make sure there's a clear, bright line between federal funding and abortions. That process move, it doesn't seem like there are many conservatives who are wise to that, and they much prefer going to their home districts and crowing about how they're going to overturn Roe versus Wade.
Yep.
When in fact, little moves like this that are already within the Overton window, so to speak, may be as effective, if not more so.
More so. And so, yeah, that's the great point, Scott. When you look at these things and you say, I mean, I'm talking about this now as just part of a mosaic of things that were so enormous and seem so intractable that even for people like you and me, when I say you, I don't mean mild-mannered Scott Ott, progressive reporter. I mean the real guy from Krypton. Things that seemed impossible, that all we could do was just basically grit our teeth and hold on and try and slow down this process. China's economy is overwhelming. There's no way to compete with them. Well, look, I'm a free trade guy, but if we're going to get completely screwed in the transaction, then okay, it's time for us to fight the way that we're being fought against. And now all of a sudden China's economy is and its economic power is decimated by this simple act of protecting American interests. And they said it could never happen. Obama said you could never push a button and get economic growth above 1%. Turns out you can. All of these things that just seem like historical inevitabilities are being undone. And as you point out, they're being undone by having the genius to simply apply the rules that have been ignored over the course of these last several decades. And by applying these rules, that's irrelevant. By tweeting about applying these rules, these major changes are getting done. Because if we had to depend on the newspapers to hear about things like this, forget about it. So what's the big picture? What's the takeaway from all of this? The takeaway is that this perpetual government, composed of both Republicans and Democrats, who are composed of two groups, elected officials who are people who seem to be willing to do or say anything in order to get the perks that they could not have gotten in the private sector, and coupled to that, a much larger army of professional bureaucrats who have, over the course of time, from the lowest person at the DMV to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI, have decided that they know what's better for the American people than the American people do. And that standing army of bureaucrats is also something that just seemed utterly, utterly invincible. Now comes a person who says, this is the law, so you're going to obey that law. You want to be in charge of managing land in Montana, move to Montana, where you can see what you're doing. You say that these two things are separate. Fantastic. Please provide a separate facility so that we know that that what you say you're doing is actually happening. And as all of these things take place, the entire edifice falls down because basically Trump is making them play by the rules. It's just that simple. Makes you wonder why no one else had done this prior.
And Bill, you know that he doesn't stand alone.
The reason reason that no one else has done it prior is because no one else has had the skin thick enough to take the abuse and the slurs that come his way as a result of doing this.
What I was going to say is, or you can likely be assured that this wasn't President Trump's idea. In fact, this idea has probably been floating around Washington, D.C. for years and brought up repeatedly to others who did not take action on it. The difference with President Trump, as you point out, is that he was willing to take action and he has the thick skin to take it. It's interesting, though. This is not going to stop abortions at abortion clinics, but it is going to change the funding recipe for that. And there are two factors that it occurs to me. Number one is, when I first saw the number, $260 million for 90 clinics across the country, I thought, $250 million? That's not as much as I thought it might be. That seems like a relative drop in the bucket for all the caterwauling about the topic of federal funding of Planned Parenthood clinics. But funding, the money is not the most important thing. The pathway to power, to paraphrase the Lyndon Johnson biography, the pathway to power is the important thing to keep that channel open. And I'm now picturing, Sally Struthers on TV infomercials saying, for just $9 a month, you can give a woman a choice to end her pregnancy. The federal government has made it impossible for us to get federal money for this, but if you will personally give. And I thought, who's going to do that? How many people are going to write a check and say, yeah, I'll pay $10 a month to make sure some more people can have abortions?
You will find that is a terrific example, a terrific kind of a thought experiment to clarify the point. You will without question find celebrities who will make that commercial for free. Ashley Judd and all the rest of them, they'll leap on the opportunity to be seen doing that. The question is, will people part with their $10 for it? I'm going to say they're not going to. I'll tell you what I do think will happen. I think probably what will happen is somebody like George Soros, who put total of 30 or 35 billion, $35,000 million on the table for programs like this. Let's say that George Soros just steps up and writes the check for the amount of money at disposal of George Soros and people like him is so enormous that $250 million is seriously, it's not a heavy lift. So you could say to then, your reply could be, well, that means that the abortions continue and we don't win anything. And on a level that is the most important level, that is true, because it's a repugnant, I don't have to tell you what abortion is in this country. But there is an enormous, enormous, enormous win in this, and it's a twofold win. One of them is, as I said before, the ability of Americans of conscience to be able to understand that they're not contributing to this mass murder project. That's very important. It's not as important as stopping it, but it's important. The second thing is that it gives us a clear example that all of the troubles that we face in this country all of them, are self-inflicted. We're not just Gulliver nailed down to, staked down to the beach while we were asleep. We're Gulliver who continues to hammer those stakes in with a little tiny little silver tack hammer. We can get up from this anytime we want to. Once we have the will to do it, we can do it. I don't mean to make my entire life about the Apollo program because it's rapidly coming to an end, this series, but basically, as I've said a few times in interviews, Scott, when John Kennedy said, "We choose to go to the moon," in 7 words, he got it all. It's like it's a choice. It's a decision to act. And when the decision has been made and the willpower is there, then everything downstream is just simply an engineering problem. It's a simple mechanical problem that a solution can be found for. The entire chain of events is dependent on having the clarity of moral vision and the courage to take the hits that you're going to take in order to do the right thing. And to me, it's just another example that Donald Trump is historically going to be seen as a monumental president. And I don't care if he's not the monumental guy that we would have wanted in terms of character and decorum and all the rest. I don't care. It really, you and I both have talked about this so many times because we both fans of Ulysses S. Grant, and really what it comes down to is the same exact thing as a story of U.S. Grant. By all accounts, he was a problem drinker. And people who were jealous of him and people who didn't like him, and certainly people on the South who didn't want to face him, kept bringing up these character flaws. And the character flaws were there. There's no question about it. But ultimately, when it's said and done, the Union was better off, and I'm exaggerating here because I know that he made significant changes in the course, but as just to put a cherry on the top, it's better to have a drunken general that fights and wins than to have somebody like George McClellan, who is absolutely immaculately uniformed and speaks 4 languages and can converse, in French and do all these things, and then go out into the field and get his butt handed to him. It's funny you mention that because I was thinking about this morning as I was getting ready to come to work today. I was thinking about the fact that once again, I was thinking about New York City actually, and I was saying if life is better under Republicans and then Democrats come along and the city goes to hell, and then finally you come back to Republicans again, like Giuliani cleans it up, why does this keep happening? And I in these little discussions I have in my head sometimes, I say to myself, the Democrats would say, well, yes, Giuliani made the city a lot more livable, but he did it for the wrong reasons. And then I had the thought, as I've had before, that for you to say that somebody like Rudy Giuliani coming in and making life better, not just for the rich white people, but for all the people in those crime-ridden communities, for him to come in and make that place a safer, happier place, there is no wrong reason for doing that. The actual result is the only thing that you really can measure this by. And once again, this guy, Cheeto Hitler, is showing this kind of operational shrewdness that was his selling point. Is this guy going to be able to understand how to make deals in a government that is not his own private domain and fiefdom? And it seems like it took him a little while to get his feet underneath him, but I'm impressed.
Well, a growing group of people have made a choice here, too. They've chosen to become members at BillWhittle.com, and the rest is just an engineering problem, as Bill says. It's getting that credit card somehow to come out of your wallet and entering the information onto the simple and secure webpage. We're glad for the people who have done that. We invite you to do the same by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking that Become a Member link. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this possible.